Good evening. So happy so many people have come tonight. Each panel has had more people coming, which is wonderful because it kind of shows how much people really want to hear these topics and panels. Tonight we have something really, really special. Kirsty Allison is a friend of mine who I met a couple of years ago, and we've been doing spoken word events in London and in Berlin alternatively, and every time it's been really, really special. I'm sure that all of you know Kirsty. In case you don't, Kirsty Allison is a spoken word poet, she's an author, she's a publisher, she's an organizer. It's endless things she does, and she does all of them very, very well. So I'm very happy to have given her this night tonight here within my exhibition, and would like to introduce Kirsty Allison, and thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Danielle, the Picciotto. I was just channeling, they do an act called Hacked the Picciotto that you can hear in some of these artworks that they've made together on the sort of the moving dolls, and they're quite great. So my channel to Danielle came via the editor of The Wire magazine, Chris Bone, and he gave me the red book that's for sale in the shop, The Beauty of Transgression. And at the time I'd been writing a book for the Red Gallery in Shoreditch about regeneration and kind of how artists get abused within that cycle. And we were hosting some events that looked at the comparisons between Detroit, Berlin, and Shoreditch, which is where I kind of grew up. Not really grew up, but kind of did my schooling. So yeah, that was kind of my introduction to Danielle. I loved the book. I hosted some panels, and then we had a conversation. I couldn't get it published anywhere, and I tried The Guardian, I tried normal places that I'd been published by and write for, and I couldn't get it out there. So I'd been running a spoken word night that was looking at the space between poetry and lyric, and the space between poetry and lyric, because I've always been interested in that, sort of having written about music all my life, and sort of been around writers, and having my first book that was supposed to be out today on the 30th of September, my debut novel, but actually, weirdly, some weird synchronicity, it was supposed to be out today, but it's coming out next year because of COVID. It's called Psychomachia. But yeah, because of that, I started a magazine called Cold Lips, because I couldn't get this interview published with Danielle, and I wanted to. So I started a magazine, and that was kind of led to us publishing 3 books so far. The first was for Richard Cabot, called Dark Entries, with photographs by Millie Radikovic, and the second book is by Martin Goodacre, and that looks at squatting history from the 80s to the end of the criminal justice bill in London. So it's a really interesting period that South London hasn't necessarily had told to it, and people I know down there haven't really been aware of what the cultural history and the regeneration of South London is. It's so well told in East London, but the South London one not so much. So the photography book by Martin Goodacre took the pictures of Kurt Cobain, the sort of the classic eyeliner and bowl cut photograph. He learned to take photography squatting in a place called the Ambulance Station in the Old Kent Road, and it was where Geese and Mary Chain did their first gig. It was where Butthole Surfers did their first gigs, and it's a really good narrative. So I'm really proud for that to be the second book on Cold Lips, and we've just done a limited. We did a show at Dash Gift for that. And we'll do a show in London sort of when we can. This is the third book, which at the beginning of COVID, I was sent to the food bank by one of the magazines that I edit on. They lost all their advertising and they had no cash. So I had to start my own thing, so I started a Substack blog, and I had supporters for it. It was really nice that people started giving me a bit of money to support my own work. So I was sending out podcasts and poetry and short stories. And yeah, it's kind of like an it's a real me thing, that, rather than me sort of being crowded by other people. So it's nice to get some money back, but to say thank you, I've got all this stuff in my archive since 007 and 007. So yeah, I decided to create a book of that, and Gilderay helped me edit the content in it, and he's also helped me choose the things that I'm gonna read tonight. Here, a great musician. We have a band together called Vagrant Lovers, and we're releasing our first stuff on the 31st of October and the 5th of November. That's featuring Danielle de Picciotto on violin and all sorts. But listen, I'm going to read some stuff from this book I've never read before. I've never read this stuff publicly, and I will be reading it rather than performing it. But it gives my pleasure, you know, once I found out we got this residency here as part of this brilliant gallery, I always come here whenever I'm in Berlin because it's kind of proper, it stinks of the old school, and I really love it. So I'm staying in a stinky old school apartment just over the road, and it's great, you know, it's really proper, and it's, because my problem is that everything's been sanitised, and the plague is just part of that. So to be here, and to be in a producer's gallery with someone who started the Love Parade with her ex-boyfriend, you know, which for me growing up was seminal. I saw it on the TV as a Europop child. I just, you know, that was everything for me. That was like, we're going to be European forever. We're going to party forever. Everything was ecstatically happy. And it was the new blood, right? But look what's happening now. So I think this is a great opportunity to introduce my guests this evening. Rob Doyle, who for me, I grew up DJing with Irving Welsh, who's a hell of a guy to sort of live under the shadow as a writer, you know. So Rob Doyle, for me, kind of recontemporizes what Trainspotting did, particularly with his new book, Threshold. And it's got a holographic cover, which interestingly sort of reflects the original cover of Trainspotting, which was kind of two skulls on silver, and I think it's just a beautiful kind of this is now thing. My collection's called Now Is Now because I think it's our responsibility as cultural people to do our own thing, and that's what this gallery is about. It's what you're about. It's what our friend here, Kieran Leonard, Saint Leonard, is doing with his music. He's toured with everyone from the Libertines to Father John Misty. He's been around and is managed by our good friend who runs Gallery 46, who we're live streaming with tonight in Whitechapel. So yeah, it's kind of a family affair, hopefully. And yeah, good to see some good crew. We've got Mark Manning in the audience, who's fucked by Rock Book, is a legendary tome. And his paintings have all been collected by Damien Hirst, proper brilliant legend. I see members of the Fat Whites here as well, who put on a beautiful party the other night. There's people who perform with Blood of a Poet, and Gabby Gunter, who's a brilliant, she's like the legendary poetry promoter, who's performed with Laurie Anderson. We've got Jason McGlade over there, he's my favourite photographer in Berlin. I'd like everybody here to have their photograph done by Jason, because he has this amazing technique where he uses old Polaroid. I'm not going to give away his technique, but it's beautiful. But yeah, he's you know, I never like photos of myself, but he's taken a portrait of me recently and I'm okay with it, so yeah. Right, so without any further ado, I'm going to kick off. Yeah? Stop talking. Stop talking. I have my lump of tourmaline in my hand. Right. This is, it was written on the 17th of March 2020, and it's a letter to Boris Johnson. Dear Boris Johnson, everything is fucked. Please instate universal basic income for all of us rather than force us to get COVID-19 loans. It would take more time and effort than we have to find out what you and your defyful associates are investing in. Whether it was Andrex that started this, or China, or your cronies that got you in power through backdoor agreements and illicit propaganda. You are maintaining pure bat fuckery. Have some fucking strategy beyond your own back pocket and do not blame the bats. Or us. Your innocuous war, where the scramble for inoculations is as pacifying as a smack lolly stolen from the sacklers puts profit first, as per Grenfell, and every fucking war you ever fucking started. Stop talking in marketing riddles. Have some common fucking decency. Yours, the undersigned, the likers, the agitators, and those of us brave enough to not be impressed by your power and background. And this one was written on the 8th of April 2020. It's called Pandemic Poet. I mean, there's been a lot of bad pandemic art, and there's been a lot of bad pandemic diaries, but I'll just add to that with this, I think. So, in paradise, it's called Pandemic Poet, did I say that? In paradise, you would be happy. Save that last dance, love, lock. We are stupid soil. Hear the undergrowth cough. 6 feet under, safe steps is the new sex, the virus, an imprint. Planes become trains, and earth casts. Love is spells. Do you remember the springtime when it was all very beautiful at the beginning? In this cauldron we inhabit gene mycelium of screen eyes. Plastic tide, hashtag slag heap, free lessons from snow blossom dreams. It's only solace for sale. So you know, we're doing like 10 minutes each and then twice. That's the sort of plan this evening. So I'm just going to do. It's like a short story. It's called The Heidi Humans. I might just do London first, okay? London is a hard town, it's a dirty town, it's full of dirty tricks and whores. It's a mean town, it's a cold town, it's a filthy, smelling, grey town. It was the Hollywood of Europe, a place to smile, not break down. It's a small town network of old town stealing new town ideas. London is my town. I'm dirty, I'm mean, and I'm old town. I'm smiling through the breakdowns. I'm clambering through the rubble of stolen dreams. I am London, and London is my town. But I might move to Berlin. So I've got like one poem here. Then I've got one. There's a few here. I haven't ever read this stuff before, so it's quite weird when you've not done that. To be quite honest, you know, because you just it takes a bit of rhythm to read them out in front of people. And it's a privilege to bloody perform again. It really is. I've travelled from London for this. I've been waiting a month, you know. So The Heidi Humans. This is a short story. The sun, I might actually sit down for it, because it's that sort of icing comfortably kind of story. So the sun came through the windows, and there was no stopping it. Windows nailed, with material hiding the outside world. But still, the light tried to enter the pit of a bedroom, which smelt of spent alcohol and incense. To have a house with perfect wool carpets and a pension. To be able to watch television without criticising it, to make monthly payments. The beds followed her around from home to home, always taunting, begging her to fuck up so bad in the outside world. Wrap her in their sarcophagus skin. She loved hiding, struggling with every second of being suspended awake. Sleep. Take the pain away. Make love with sleep and hide well. The prison of looking out. Essential solitude, preparing for the loneliness of death, 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 her spirit animal, dried bones, sunken cheeks. And in the yard, the birds came from annual migrations in their dinghies, if their dinghies do not drown. The painful day when thoughts don't add up, and the fractured, surreal madness of blood being a cocktail, slop bucket, the doom of death, the tragedy of being childless, of never being able to let the cum stay inside through fear of not being able to provide for another. It was nihilistic obsession to hide, to be unable to adjust the pillows to comfort. It was about feeling the pain, wallowing in the afterburn, not knowing how to deal with life passing. The sheer beauty of the world made her feel guilty to engage with it. Like she didn't deserve the hills and the sunlight. So heating up water for a hot water bottle, she'd failed to look after herself. The madhouses, running around Dublin in a turmeric-stained suit, the white cat crawled like clockwork along the back wall, leaving its footprints where the fox had run in the previous night. It was all going down, and she found a clean glass for some filtered water, standing naked, the floor cold, and blood came from her womb. Black knicker, mesh slide. And in the old bath, which still had the skin of the cancerous woman from before, she washed, and she let her hair drown. She dreamt of past beaches, of never returning to those freedoms, the acts of her consciousness, wanting to hide, to not join in, to ignore, to keep the duvet safely against the skin, to feel each other's skin safe, hiding. And the days lost to being Heidi were growing. And rather than fight them, she embraced them, glorifying in the squelch of darkness, books piled as defence, walls around the room, and clothes piled up by the windows, until she was better enough to make the bed and leave.
Right, I'll finish on a light poem, right? This is called, it's short, Crime Syndicate Nail Bar. Avatar, doll face, dream in a world where the trade of love is all your vapidity of insecurity, of super me, youth and glitter clean, makes you fuck. Like the pawn you are made to adore. You're a robot, star child. As the refugee rent boys scream, we all want to live forever. We throw ourselves into the abyss, the stinking piss of lipless, sun-ripped, ankle-knocking tits at the threat of this ego-tech intersectionality and fear governed by the invisible maniacs. Post-death SEO will not save you. And your pig karma, vegan, adrenaline, karma, we will all be deleted.
Neatly followed by Rob Doyle. So Rob Doyle, right? I'm the arts editor of DJ Magazine. I came across a tweet for a book saying this is full of drugs, it's about Berlin, it kind of goes to Boliano territory and it's brilliant.
And I was like, oh, hi. So, you know, that's my kind of jam, right? So, and I read it and had the pleasure to interview Rob for DJ Magazine, and we've since kind of spoken for various podcasts and things. There's one on Cold Lips now. And yeah, what a cool guy. He's been playing percussion for the Fat White Family. And,
a long and storied career.
And he's got his first film, kind of his book, his second book has been made into a film called...
First book.
First book?
Yeah. Here Are the Young Men.
Here Are the Young Men, which I haven't seen yet because it's not released. So keep an eye out for that because it'll be brilliant. And definitely read Threshold. It's like really it's my book of the year, and I can't say it's great to find a writer who's our generation and just kind of summarises everything that I think is really now, and kind of his authorial thing of it's just really postmodern of kind of who is the writer, and it's kind of very current thing that I'm seeing in literature across the board. It's an awareness of who the author is within the context of the story, and I think his book does it perfectly. Please give a round of applause to the
Thanks a million, Kirsty, and it's lovely to get a chance to say publicly thank you to Kirsty because, yeah, she wrote about me. When Threshold came out a few months ago, she wrote about it for DJ Magazine, and I had a kind of moment. I realized, wow, I'm so much cooler than all the other Irish writers because they're not in DJ Magazine, and I am. So I owe her something. And thanks to Danielle and Neurotitan. I have to say, this is my first in real life reading that I've done since the plague descended. I've done a few, you know, you try to promote your book, you go out on the campaign trail and you do all that stuff and you do events and reading, but like everything else, that all just got cancelled. So this is the first time you're all so elegantly socially distanced and so forth. So this is the first, I think Berlin has its shit together in a way that Dublin, where I'm from, doesn't quite. So this is the first time I've got to read in public. So I'm very grateful to you all for coming out. So yeah, I'm going to read from the book that Kirsty talked a little bit about, which is called Threshold. And because we're in Berlin, I'm going to read the Berlin chapter just to really get in, fucking your minds. I was wondering as I watched Kirsty, should I stand up or should I sit? And I was getting very confused with all questions. So what I'm going to do is sit for the first one and stand up for the second. Next level. On Christmas Eve, I visited Linda at her flat in the high-rise in Lichtenberg. She cooked pumpkin soup while I reclined in the hammock that bisected the living room at an angle, rolling one Skinner joints for Linda to smoke in the narrow kitchen while she told me stories about her travels and love affairs. To me, Linda embodied all that was vital and underground in Berlin. When I thought of Berlin, I thought of it as the city where Linda lived. But now she was thinking of moving away. At least she'd had enough of the winters. I want to go where there are hammocks out of doors, she said. Tenerife, I said, licking a cigarette paper. Maybe Koh Samui, she replied, for the trans parties. The place I want to go is Kyoto, though I like imagining it as much as I'd probably enjoy being there. They have temples, cherry blossoms, poems about the moon. She said, even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's cry, I long for Kyoto. Drawing on a fresh joint, she told me she had finally got round to reading my books. She said she found my writing brave. I shifted in the hammock and replied that it made me uneasy whenever someone described myself as brave. It made me think I'd humiliated myself in ways I hadn't quite intended. She asked me what I was working on now, and when I told her, she wondered if I ever felt I was living a certain way only so that I could write about it. If Linda's phone hadn't rung just then, I might have told her that the time when I could have understood such a question had passed, that I had long since solved the problem of authenticity, of making existence adhere to itself. I might have told her that my life was the research for the book I was writing about my life, and that this book, which was many books, would justify that life. Linda might then have smiled sadly and concluded that writing was a symptom of the sickness for which it was also the cure. Instead, she told me a story in which she decided to have a child with a man in India before realizing at a point when it might well have been too late that this was imperfectly wise. The story surprised me in that I had always viewed Linda's commitment to childlessness as an inviolable element of her nature. This had intrigued me when we first met in South America. Moreover, I could relate. The difference was that, whereas Linda was concerned with political issues and worried about the direction society was taking, these days I appraised myself to be not only childless, but childish. That is, I lived like a child, concerned exclusively with novelty and selfish delight, relating even to geopolitics and the prospect of planetary catastrophe as modes of entertainment. Sometimes I judged myself brutally for this, but even the self-reproach seemed a kind of decadence, an exquisite late capitalist masochism. More often, I gave myself over to pleasure with ease of conscience, enjoying the spectral glow of what felt on so many nights like the twilight of a jaded civilization. I seemed to myself nakedly symptomatic of a general decline. When an epoch started tolerating the likes of me, you knew the game was up. It was nice to live like a child, though, better than it was to live as a man. Being a man was a grim slog of duty and sacrifice and repressed desire. Men had built European civilization, driven its expansionist phase, and now it fell to us, history's children, to squander it. Linda and I talked for a few hours, then I went home. We did not have sex. This was hardly remarkable, yet it was striking too, because a decade earlier, that had been all we did, have sex. We had never been explicitly in a relationship, so it wasn't exactly that we had broken up and were now simply friends. Linda was getting older, and I was getting older too, at precisely the same rate. What had once been a raging blaze was now an affectionate glimmer. This was what aging meant. You had less sex, even with those with whom you once had record-breaking amounts of sex. Lust waned and friendship blossomed, and this was okay. It was nice. I'm going to stay in the same chapter, but skip forward a little bit to, it's now New Year's Day, early in the morning, when my friend Connor and I pushed into the crowd that danced under a barrage of gut-shaking beats on the main floor at Berghain. I feel such a cliche of a man reading about Berghain here. Oh man, get away with this in Ireland. It's kind of like transgressive, edgy. The immense club in a former plant by the river for the last day of the epic New Year's party. My euphoria at getting in, after a tense moment's hesitation by the doorman, blossomed into wonderment at what this place really was. Throughout the New Year's party, all areas were open, including the gay sex dungeon below ground with its warren of crannies and dark rooms, everywhere connected to everywhere else, so that you could simply walk in any direction and eventually get to wherever you wanted to be. Every freak in Europe had apparently converged here, the mutants of a weird emerging era. Naked men sucked one another off on couches or fucked in elaborate group formations atop tables, while women with bare breasts and fetish gear danced frenetically, each dancer distinct from the others and yet for the others, a gathering in ecstasy whose constituents, by conforming to no set way of dancing, formed a collective in beauty. There was always someone older or younger, nakeder or weirder than you, and the fact that photography was forbidden and there were no mirrors anywhere reinforced the ethos of participation over gawking, immersion over separation. In the crowd you lost any distinction between dancing and being danced. broke clear of selfhood right at the point where the self became exalted and sovereign. The assembly was like some rogue faction from Mad Max Fury Road, a futurist goth convoy enjoying one last techno orgy before roaring into battle. The gloomy industrial interior, dark corridors, steel platforms, abyssal shafts, recalled not a film but a video game, the iconic 90s first-person shooter Quake. On the main floor, the music was menacing and intense. Up here at the panorama bar, where the shutters let sunlight stream in whenever the beat dropped, it was celebratory and joyous. Techno was like contemporary art. The terrain was so vast that even if I tried to keep up the speed, I would always be chasing a scene that shifted faster than I could track it. Techno in the 21st century was a self-replicating code in constant, restless mutation. The names changed as soon as you learned them, but it didn't matter because it was all one word track, an expanding aural singularity that throbbed in bedrooms and squats and flowed through fiber optic cables, which DJs tapped into and redirected through pulsating Function 1 sound systems like these. I'd forgotten, but I'd forgotten, said Connor, when we rested against a balcony above hundreds of dancers surveying the scene. It's like when you take psychedelics. You get back to that place and you think, oh yeah, of course, how could I forget? But you're not able to not forget. The experience entails its own unrememberability. At some point in Berghain's atemporal carnival, I wandered into the subterranean labyrinth, seeking the disco that was down there amid the dark, winding tunnels. I stepped into a dim, tight room lined with urinals. The walls and floor were grey brick. I seemed to have crossed into a murky and haunted underworld because, as I stood over a urinal, a disembodied head floated towards me with eerie slowness. That was how I saw it, a head floating in the darkness, stopping inches from my cock. A man, topless and tattooed in leather trousers, had crawled on his hands and knees across the slosh of piss and filth, and now he was kneeling at my crotch. His expression was urgent and solemn, as if we were performing a ceremony. I figured he wanted to suck me off, and I shook my head. He gazed at the flow of my piss, entranced. As I was finishing, I waved it and splashed some on his face, over his lips. He grimaced in pleasure. As I zipped up, he withdrew and slithered back into the shadows with the same otherworldly slowness. That was insane, I said when I found Connor perched on a giant swing alongside a dozen others. There was a guy down in the toilets who wanted to drink my piss. Oh yeah, the toilet guy. I saw him again as the day wore on, in other toilets throughout the club, always alone, stalking the urinals with a fixed, pathetic cringe. Who was he? What had happened to make this his destiny? Crawling through filth to drink the piss of strangers? He was abjection incarnate, a being who had sunk further into a basement than anyone I had encountered. I felt a sympathy, a tenderness for him. He seemed to me both admirable for fully inhabiting his perversion and terribly sad. He must have been broken to seek out such humiliation. I envisioned a childhood of rape in dank basements, a howling, obscene mother. When the night outside synced with Berghain's perpetual night, I sought out the dungeon urinals again, following narrow passages past rooms where men fisted, sucked, and got as far inside one another as they could. I knew he would be there, and that he would come to me. In the dark toilets, I unzipped. Immediately, he emerged from the shadows, that same cringing face. This time I let him drink it all. It streamed over his mouth, his lips. He gulped, gurgled, his eyes rolled back in ecstasy. I pissed long and hot in his abject face. He swallowed all he could, and the rest overflowed on his chin. As the stream relented, he glanced up and met my gaze. Danke, he rasped. Danke. Thank you.
Brilliant stuff, thank you, Rob Doyle. I'm wondering, I don't know what the plan is. It's quite difficult sitting down all the time. But yeah, we've got to be quite tight on time this evening. So yeah, if you do need to sort of vacate, maybe kind of do it between people. That's kind of always nice. So, but yeah, Kieran Leonard performs as Saint Leonard, and he's been working on this piece of literature for 6 years, is it?
Yeah.
Kieran? Yeah, it's called Any Muse, and it's currently about 500,000 words long. Yeah. This is the first time he's ever read from it, and I can't wait to hear it. He's a great writer, and he's kind of interested in the esoteric, and has performed with the Stanley Kubrick Foundation. That's where you recorded your first album, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And you've just done the one album so far.
I've done two actually.
Okay.
It was the second one was re-recorded at Kubrick's house.
And then you've been recording a load at Church Studios.
At Church, yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of in progress at the moment.
It is, yeah. I'm going to finish it in Berlin. Now I've moved here as of yesterday. So.
Yeah, so welcome. So kind of I knew Kieran had been asking, he thought I lived here, so he'd been asking me about sort of moving here and stuff. Yeah, that was kind of, I was like, oh, so I'm doing this show, why don't you come do it and like sort of start your thing here. Yeah, so here we go. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Cheers. Thank you very much, Rob. That's almost impossible to follow. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, so I'm going to read you a bit of this book, which, yeah, I started writing this about 6 years ago. After, basically, the idea was it was like a self-help therapy thing, basically, because it was one evening I was on tour supporting another artist, and something happened one night in Vienna. Like I fell in love with somebody unexpectedly and unwillingly. And that simple decision, that one night, basically that one evening, just unravelled my life in ways that are pretty hard to even explain. Even my closest friends, when I've explained it to them, just cannot get their head around how those decisions unfolded. And so I started writing this just to try and sort of get my head around it. And it was going to be a short 60-page novella thing about a couple of drinks in a bar one night. And then it expanded. There was mission creep, and I had to write about 880 pages of it. So this is the first time I've read it to anyone, and this is my first night as being a resident in Berlin. Well, last night was my first night, so I'm very happy to be here. So here we go. And basically, just to fill you in, the book's called A Muse, and this is the first bit of it, meeting this woman who I fell in love with in a bar in Vienna and having a conversation. Pinky levelled her eyes onto me, making some silent judgment, appraising some unseen symbol I appeared to be flaunting in temper. Her eyes were recording everything, every eerie interplay of mind and matter between us. She placed her lighter back on the marble tabletop with a theatrically well-timed click. It made me think of the conch in A Lord of the Flies. There was a reason that I invited you here tonight. Yes, of course there was. I didn't react at all. Just continued to meet her gaze, trying my hardest to repress any telltale micro-expressions on my face. Any atom of information that she got hold of, I knew she would instantly split apart and unleash more Shiva-like destruction on my already wasteland-like life. I just wanted to get to know you. She reached for the word, better. since we'll be working so closely together now. What? There was a wayward, unrestrained note rising in my voice as conspicuously as a hissed-up violinist in an orchestra. I just thought it would be nice for us to talk some more, somewhere alone, somewhere where we could come to stand each other on a different plane than just the professionality of performance. So it's not just showbiz, you know. Do you manufacture a bespoke clay cat's head effigy every time you invite someone for a drink? She laughed, throwing her head back and letting the empty room feel the full force of her mirth. I felt my newly discovered utter disgust for her rise again, a dull pulse ebbing in the back of my neck. Now, I should just explain, before I went on tour, I had moved to an old church on the moors of Yorkshire to make a record, and that was a really bad decision. Anyway, she's alluded to that now. So. Now, about that church of yours, did you leave a little Miss Leonard behind waiting for you? Her brazen condescension was enough to make me consider committing a new female-fronted crucifixion. She delivered this awful inquiry with all the grace of a stiletto to my chest. I caught her eyes flicker down to the engagement ring that I had exchanged with my fiancée, glinting on my finger wrapped around the stem of my cocktail glass. They then flicked back to meet my own eyes. For a moment, I caught myself admiring with almost sickening vividity of their lizard-like vertebrae. There was something else in them too, some other presence, a thought withheld. Is that what you invited me here to ask? She let out a ripple of laughter. I felt any flickering fascination for the elegance of her opal ocularities drain from me instantly. Well, is there, Leonard? I'm intrigued. Does anyone really live in an abandoned church on their own? Well, yes and no. She arched an eyebrow. That again I found myself unwillingly admiring for its delicate, dark, traced curve set against the rush of light and shade in her carefully unkempt blonde hair. Well, I haven't actually spoken to her for days. Weeks now, actually. She was working her way when I left, and then there was a blizzard, and then I was away on this tour, and I haven't been able to get hold of her. It's been difficult, she said firmly, finishing my sentence. Yes, I agreed, my tongue dry in my mouth. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for the both of you, living in such a foreboding, frigid place, all alone, just the two of you up there on those black and barren moors. How did you know it was on the moors? Well, you told me yourself. You told me all about it, Leonard. When? One night recently, I think. She rolled her eyes and finished the last of her volatile martini dregs. I found my mind drifting for a moment, ebbing in some unseen current of thought, carrying me away from this Baroque ballroom in Vienna, across space and time and back to that church, back to those ecclesiastical vaulting spaces where I had lived with my ex-fiancée, very briefly, and perhaps not entirely happily. Pinky clicked her fingers. I glanced up, the trance fading. She was in fact just getting a waiter's attention, who dutifully arrived and took the order for 2 more martinis. Gazing hard into the slender orbit of her ankle bone, I said, I'm not sure if I really wanted to move there, to be perfectly honest with you, Pinky. Who could blame you, Leonard? Her voice gently purred, and though she did not appear to have moved at all, I felt that she had edged imperceptibly closer to me. You know, I think sometimes of our experience of reality, it being somewhat like a stylus moving over the grooves of a record. If we were to observe the minute undulations and peaks and troughs in the vinyl, it would make very little sense to us as music. It is only if we relax and let go and let the music play that we can have a sense of the whole experience of the song. Otherwise, it would just all appear as shattered fragments of sound and random vibration. It is the experience of the sequence of notes that generates the melody, and in turn that melody carries the meaning, the emotion, the inevitable. I stared at her. The second martini was cranking my mental gears. Oh, I think I see where you're going with this. Now tell me something about you and Tiberius. Jesus, what's the great mystery? I've known him for years. We sing, we write, we perform together. What more do you want to know? How did you meet him? I can't imagine he's the sort of person that you just run into at a party and start collaborating with. She smiled at me. Well, you'd be surprised. You really would. I met him in California. I had left New York on my 20th birthday to try and find a certain sound that I'd been hearing in my head since I was a child. Arriving first in LA, the sweet sirens of Big Sur drew me up the northern coast. I was playing at being a Kerouacian hippie for a summer. Somehow I fell in with some friendly beats who looked after me, giving me rides, good times. I could barely play guitar, and at that time I only had one song of my own, but it was one that I had laboured on for hours, and it carried me further than perhaps it should. People would smile when they heard it, and they'd offer me whiskey and cigarettes and shelter and other things. The song was called Aphrodite's Ass. One night we had lit a campfire on the beach just outside of Monterey. I'm sure you're aware of it. It's known as Steinbeck country. Well, that evening, the girls shuddered in the shadows of the breaking surf, and the fire crackled shimmering pine sparks as it does only there in that part of the world. The sand hot, hotter than it was even during the day. And I saw a lone man striding towards our number. He had an ancient-looking guitar in his hand, and I could see it swinging in silhouette against the wine-dark sea. No one seemed disturbed as this darkly bearded and heavy-cut presence joined our number. It was hard to make him out, precisely in the flickering of the campfire, but I knew right away there was something unusual about him, like he contained a certain secret, and one suspected he might impart it to us if only we made him welcome. I had, back in the Grand Viennese bar, become transfixed as she spoke. This was perhaps the most that she had said to me, the most of her inner world that she had ever shared. I sensed a kind of truth ringing in these words, as if for a moment she had forgotten the childish mind game we were playing, and instead was now shaping the air around us into a world that she had once known and clearly loved, with simply the sound of her voice and the colour of her words. And I found her storytelling, in spite of myself, incredibly seductive. I cleared my throat to speak, but with a vague and undulating movement of voice and body, she snake-like forbade any interruption and continued her story. Well, that night, as the fire began to die down and the merriment had waned into concerns as to whose van or place we would be staying at, this mysterious man leant forward towards the flames. And I know this sounds needlessly melodramatic, Leonard. Well, he swung his guitar over his shoulder and began to play the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Now, at this moment, dear reader, despite being utterly transfixed by her story, I really had to stifle a smirk. I could, truth be told, barely contain myself, because I absolutely fucking loathed that particular sort of late-night mysterious wayfaring man on a beach with a guitar and the wistful searching eyes. I really wanted to tell her so. I looked up directly into her perfectly aquiline face. She had, since I last glanced at her, surrendered the disaffected Elizabethan predisposition and had become much more earnest, much more like a willful child, eyes wrapped in the searing heat of her own story, breathless in the retelling. It was as if I was seeing her back then when this first fateful encounter had happened, as if she had somehow transported herself into that very spot with the intensity of her own narration. It was an extraordinary expression of unbridled innocence. Go on, I nodded. Well, Leonard, he played me this song. It is one that he performs on tour now. But, of course, that night was the very first time that I had heard it, and it was entirely unlike any music I had ever heard before. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if the beach, the sea, the sky just sort of evaporated around him as he sang. He left us all suspended in seemingly infinite planes, where time felt flexible, and you could will a thing, a thought, or a person into being. And there was no true causation, only the ever-flowing and meandering rhythms and the sublime vision of his words. That sounds like a fucking hit. What drugs are you on? With this, her raptured expression broke, and she cast me a look, the kind of look that I would later come to adore from her, a sort of withering playfulness. And the corners of our mouths twitched briefly into a cherubic, self-admonishing smile. Well, yes, quite. Well, from that day hence, I never left his side. Hang on, you're telling me the man on the beach with the guitar was Tiberius Red? Well, yes, obviously, darling. So, well, I just moved in with him, stayed with him, and, well, she let out a direct current of laughter. Well, that actually brings us right up to what I wanted to speak to you about tonight. Hang on, he plays you one song, and that was it. You've been his, what are you to? His collaborator, his assistant? She shot me a look. No, I can see it's clearly more than that, Leonard. So anyway, one song and that was it? Well, she said, it was a very, very special song. Song is what this is all about. As I've also said to you, that's why you're here. I mean, literally right now. Forget any notions that you might be harbouring about free will. Pinky, I must say, it's you who's sounding alarming now. Quite alarming, she continued. I mean, when did you choose to be here, right now, in this exact spot, drinking these exact drinks, here, exactly with me? I paused, a little wrong-footed by her strange supposition. Likewise, when did you really choose to join this tour? When did you make all those decisions? Matter-of-factly, coolly, calmly, level-headedly. Like logical little thought stepping stones, carrying across a raging torrent of chaos, contingency, and random life events, leading you all the way here to this precise moment. Was it all of your own free will? Well, anyway, I'll stop there.
It's kind of magical, and you know, I think, who was it? I'm always attributing this to different people, but someone wise once said, like, writing about music is like dancing to architecture.
I think it was Elvis Costello.
To me, it was like that. So yeah, kind of, that's beautiful. It felt like the beauty of music to me, that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Saint Leonard. I just want him to be called Saint Leonard. Just all the time. All the time. Saint Leonard. What a name, right? Okay. So, yeah, here we go. Some more from the very tall Rob Doyle.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, myself and Kieran / Leonard were talking earlier before about this novel in progress, and you did say that you're the only person whose name you haven't changed. And what I'm curious about is which songwriter is that Tiberius? Or you can tell me after. So I'm going to read from the same book I was reading from before, Threshold. I'm going to go to a whole different chapter. I don't really need to explain the plot and all that because there isn't really one. It's just this autobiographical, kind of meandering, semi-fictional thing. But this is one, it's a chapter called Mediterranean, or at least part of a chapter called that. And it's pretty self-explanatory. On the cusp of autumn, convinced, for reasons I will get into, that it was absolutely necessary for me to get out of Paris for a few days, I conceived the idea of making a journey to Blanes on the Costa Brava in northeast Spain. The Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño had lived in Blanes for many years, and I had read about a 17-stage Bolaño walking tour that had been inaugurated there in 2013 on the 10th anniversary of his death. The Ruta Literaria Bolaño in Blanes and the article I would write about it to cover costs and pay the rent seemed a strong enough pretext for me to leave Paris. On a Tuesday morning, I rode a crowded metro to the Gare de Lyon and there boarded a train to Barcelona. It was a double-decker and my seat on the upper floor faced backwards so that as we travelled, the landscape receded in front of me. On the journey, I read Monica Maristand Bolaño, A Biography and Conversations. The book is essentially a series of transcribed interviews with people who knew Bolaño, presented without much attempt at ordering or interpreting the material. Maristand is gushingly, irritatingly admiring of Bolaño. It is hard to avoid the accusation of hagiography when a writer insists on comparing her subject to a saint. As I read on, every little thing Maristand wrote grated on me. I should have been enjoying the journey, but instead I was all tensed up with irritation towards this lazy biographer. I closed the book, or rather I turned it off, for I was reading on an e-reader which I bought, a Kindle, which I bought the day before moving to France to curb my habitual accumulation of physical books while on the move. I watched the landscape vanish before me as we sped towards the south. To put it bluntly, I was in a wretched, nervous condition. It felt like weeks since I'd last had a decent night's sleep. Lying awake at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, I had been unable lately to slow the apocalyptic whirring of my thoughts. For years I had been living a largely solitary existence, and it had never bothered me much. In Paris, though, it was getting to me badly. If you spend too much time alone, I reflected, then what would otherwise be a disturbing but transient thought will grow to immense, grotesque, obsessional proportions, so that finally you fear everything, emanating weirdness and menace on the streets and in the metro. Your sleeping will go to hell and life will lose its flavor. Food, music, books, people, the days themselves, all of it will taste the same, taste of nothing. The very strategies you previously adopted to ward off paranoia and dejection, a good diet, exercise, will fall by the wayside. You will not eat well, and you will certainly not jog. It will soon go from bad to worse, I reflected, so that when a friend comes to visit you in Paris, you will be terrified at the prospect of their arrival, for you will have forgotten how to do the simplest things, such as shake someone's hand, make conversation, have dinner in company. In this abject condition, you will walk the streets of Paris, and you will look to the beauty that surrounds you, and this beauty will leave you unmoved. The women will not stir your lust, and it will seem that you will never lust again. He gets to Barcelona. I dragged my suitcase away from Sound Station into the hot afternoon. Actually, skip that. I dragged my suitcase away from the Sound Station into the hot afternoon and stopped for lunch at the first decent-looking restaurant. Ordering my meal from the young, sullen waiter, I was pleased to find that my Spanish, dormant these last few years, was basically intact. On first moving to Paris, I had made considerable efforts to improve my French, which hitherto had been basic. I studied daily and soon reached a passable conversational level. Had I kept at it, I would have made significant advances in the months that had elapsed since that initial assiduous period. By now I would have been confidently reading French novels, buying Libération and Le Monde, listening to current affair programs and literary discussions on the radio. A couple of months into my stay, however, I broke up with my French girlfriend and went to live on my own in a sprawling, shabby apartment in the 19th arrondissement that looked onto a vine-strewn courtyard. The end of the relationship removed any urgency to improve my French. It also foreclosed an entire future life, one that my girlfriend and I had dreamed up together and for a while believed in. In this foreclosed future, we would live together in Paris, hang out with her artist friends, write side by side through the day and read to one another in the evenings, counting our blessings all the while for the children we didn't have. Of course, I had only ever felt partly committed to this potential future. As good as it seemed, it cancelled out all the other potential futures, and so I resented it a little, and finally it dissolved before me. Gradually, it was coming to seem that the only future I would have was a stark, lonely one that was not chosen so much as drifted into, the kind of future you get if you persistently decline to make the decisive gesture. In the solitude of my post-breakup life in Paris, as the summer ended and my days stretched on in silence, I became fixated on the idea that the difficulties of my life were intractable. At moments of extreme nervous tension, the anxiety aroused by such obsessional thinking provoked fantasies of suicide. In the quiet of my vine-covered apartment, I would look up from whatever I was doing and imagine myself hanging from the rafters in the spooky spare bedroom whose door hung open as if in dismal invitation. In the grip of these fantasies, I would draft suicide notes in my head, carefully worded to inflict a minimal damage on those who survived me. I would consider how to hang myself in the least painful way, and wonder if it were possible to avoid traumatizing whoever would find me there, swinging over the grimy floorboards. Despite the recurrence of these fantasies, I was confident that I would not kill myself, for now at least. Having the option of killing myself sufficed. I basically relished life and wanted to keep living. From a more cosmic perspective, the existence of the universe had come to seem to me utterly implausible. All explanations of it were equally unsatisfactory, hence equally feasible. As a result, I wasn't fully confident that my life was not, say, an elaborate, hallucinated challenge, a sort of existential video game in which the goal was to climb onto some higher plane of being by proving oneself in this one. Perhaps the unseen arbiters would look upon self-slaughter as the worst sort of failure, and I would thus be relegated to some more terrible sphere. Best to slog it out and leave the world by natural causes, just in case. Also, I lacked the physical courage to go through with suicide. Unless I could get some reliably fatal pills, of which kind? The various methods of killing myself at my disposal, hanging, throwing myself from a tall building, slashing my arteries, plunging into a deserted stretch of the Sound late at night, and so on, were too painful and risky. There was only one way I would have the balls to kill myself, and that was by shooting myself in the skull. That seemed by far the best way of doing it. Quick, loud, bloody, and hopefully painless. All of this was fanciful, though. I could not shoot my skull because I didn't live in a country where I could acquire a gun. The only country I knew where I'd be able to buy a gun was America, and I could never live there again. I'd rather kill myself. Besides, did anybody watch the fucking US presidential debates last night? Did you set an alarm for 3 in the morning to wake up and watch it? Man, that's perverse. You did? It's a crazy shit show. It's fucking nuts. It superseded my expectations. Like the heavyweight clash of the century. Besides, the last couple of weeks had seen an emissary of light enter my Paris life. A cat. My landlord and his wife were going on holiday, and, for a modest deduction in rent, I had agreed to mind their cat while they were away. I had grown up with a mother who was afraid of cats, technically allophobic, and so this was to be the first time I had ever lived with a cat. His name was Bobu. I spent hours with him each day, frolicking, observing his ways, courting his affection. The cat was mysterious to me. His habit was to leap up and plunge his fangs into my wrist, clawing me violently. After a few days with him, my arms were latticed with cuts. I wondered if this was the cat's way of playing, but it seemed likelier that he just hated me. I gazed into his eyes and comprehended nothing. I thought of how the ancient Egyptians worshipped cats as inscrutable gods sojourning on the earth. Despite his inexplicable rage, I relished frolicking with my Bobu, stroking him, holding his paws, taunting when he ignored me so he would bite and scratch me again. Being mauled was preferable to his indifference. I felt I was getting more out of all of this than he was. He probably just wanted me to fuck off. But I had nowhere to go and nothing to do, so I would curl up next to him, making plaintive meow sounds which he imperiously ignored. Like a wretched lover, I was scorned and humiliated by the object of my affections, pitiably colluding in my own abasement. Thanks very much.
sorry, that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for writing. Okay, so we're going to hear from Kieran again, and then I'll close, and then we're all free to pass the night away. I hope you've been enjoying it.
Yeah, I just want to say what an honour it is to read with Rob, because Threshold was a book that Kirsty recommended to me, and it really did hit me right between the eyes in the middle of lockdown. It was like a stunning read. So this is later on in the book, and I have fairly obviously now eloped with this Pinky character to California, and I'm beginning to get the inklings that she's maybe honey trapped me into something I wasn't entirely sure what I was getting involved with. And she invites me, the first thing that happens when I arrive is she invites me to a wedding. It was a very unusual wedding, and I've sort of written it quite breathlessly, so I'm going to read it quite quickly, but it was the weirdest, one of the weirdest fucking things I've been to, but the clearing was a 600-foot radius, directly in front of the library itself. There was a flickering flame torches demarcating the periphery, and dozens of dripping red candles illuminating the length of the pentagrammatical arrangement of tables. Long wooden benches traversed either side of these tables, and at the head of each one stood an ornately carved, thronish chair, not all of which were occupied. Some of the congregation were now standing and moving towards the centre of this clearing, where there was a solitary, majestic pine tree, soaring vertically skyward several hundred feet above our heads, its canopy as reaching and heaven-bound as a high church, and before its narrow terrestrial trunk was what appeared to be a crude wooden altar, a square-legged table garlanded with wild flowers and adorned with coloured silks and several large books, and ornamented and bejewelled instruments, the precise details of which I could not clearly make out. In the background shadows of the pines behind, I could see a small cluster of glimmering campfires and several ancient-looking, well-weathered teepees. I could only speculate as to the function of these teepees and what they would serve at the reception. There were already one or two narcotically twisted revellers wandering amongst them. The throngs of tastefully underdressed guests began to gently swell forward to find their place before the altar, preempting the beginning of the ceremony. The casual tempo of this informality made me feel uneasy and a little socially exposed, as I was, of course, the totally uninvited guest. There was the rushing red-hot pang of shame of the bona fide wedding crasher, and then I realised I had misplaced Pinky. Turning around sharply to face back into the glowing light emanating from the open double doors of the library, I saw, to my palpable surprise, Tiberius Red, standing in soft silhouette, a cigarette dangling from his lips, and he was staring directly at me. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if both equally surprised and transfixed by the sudden awareness of the other's presence. But then I realised he'd probably been watching me for some time. Perhaps since I'd stumbled out from the wooded path with Pinky, wherever she was now. I threw up my hand in an automatic nervous wave, but he didn't respond, aside from taking a long, deliberately disarming drag on his glowing cheroot. He exhaled a thick cerulean plume of smoke into the thawing, dry California night air, and I found myself propelled towards him, my legs acting like long levers, almost before I felt that I had made the conscious decision to do so. In a moment, I had traversed the 20 feet of brushing scrub between us and was extending my hand in an open, effusive gesture of greeting, when it was suddenly seized by Pinky, who was half dancing and half running from somewhere out of nowhere to intercept me. "Darling, it's time we took our positions," she said breathlessly, her eyes flashing, betraying what I sensed was an unfamiliar emotion of mildly whirring alarm. "I was just about to, yes, see Tiberius, I know, but you can speak to him later. I want to get a good spot to watch my friends get married." She planted a censoring kiss firmly on my half-open mouth. I looked past her as she started pulling away from me, tugging at my arm in the direction of the altar. I dug my heels into the dusty soil in resistance and craned my neck back towards the library doors, but oddly, Tiberius had now vanished. She pulled my hand over the undulating, ankle-turning ground, back towards the crowded space beneath the towering pine tree. Unseen ushers had extinguished the flickering lights, and the candles had all been snuffed out. In accordance with the absence of illumination, a timely hush. The hairs on my arms stood on end, like the stubble of a harvested cornfield, as a strong psychic throng, as clear and deep as a gong, thronged through the matrimonial gathering. The chevaliers-to-be, John and Charlotte, stepped forward from some unseen position behind the great tree. They were followed, to my surprise, by one of my absolutely favourite cult songwriters, an individual widely known only just a little more for his artistry than his famed reclusivity. The kind of musician it's easy not to believe is truly real, and yet, despite the eye-straining low light, there he was. His bald head and vast ginger beard were unmistakable. He was wearing a capacious white gown and had a Grecian garland of flowers around his neck. His shining head was adorned with a glinting laurel. He was the image of Bacchus himself. He also had the air of an officiator. He was clearly the priest of the proceedings. He stood directly behind John and Charlotte, who faced towards us, their arms by their sides, both palms facing out. John dressed simply in a white shirt and in a black tuxedo suit and trousers, his long hair rakishly slicked back. Charlotte in a simple, traditional cream 50s wedding dress, her long dark hair and curled, and a hint of playful glamour from the flash of a brilliant red lipstick smile on her lips. The air came alive. A low, keening, lifting, C-sharp note rose resonant from what must have been a score of silver trumpets muted with silk from a place, was it even possibly an orchestra pit, secreted in the trees. 10 trumpets, 20 trumpets, a century of trumpeteers blowing up a paradise from the shadows. The note crescendoed in a perfect treetop rustling parabola and then died away and sank into barely perceptible crash of the nearby Pacific breakers. The cult songwriter, come bacchanalian master of ceremonies, stepped forward and spoke in a gently authoritative voice. We are gathered here today to celebrate and witness together the union of John and Charlotte. I placed my arm softly around Pinky's small frame pressed close beside me. My head momentarily swam. How on earth had this happened? How was I here, in this place, witnessing this? Something had either gone terribly, terribly wrong, or terribly, terribly right. How are we doing for time? We should wrap it up.
How are we doing on time, Danielle? I don't know what time it is. We don't know what time it is. Carry on. Entertain us all night,
Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up really quickly.
Oh God, I've got 10 minutes on the dot, so yeah.
Over to you. Thank you.
Oh no, finish. I want to hear where it was going. I want to know where we were ending up there.
Let me just finish. The ceremony was beautiful. It was gentle, thoughtful, and intensely intimate, as can be possibly expressed without giving it all away. It was nothing like any other wedding I'd ever attended. I noticed there was a slightly voyeuristic tone to the proceedings, caused in part by the complete absence of any light in the congregation. It felt more like we were the hushed audience of an opening night. It felt more like we were a hushed audience opening night theatre. Which only increased the natural.
Hurry up! No.
Which only increased the theatrical nature of the moment. We were all lucky witnesses to this one night only performance of the most ancient and sacred of ceremonies. There was a group exhalation of breath, and a giggling catharsis wave of relief broke across the congregation as the priestly songwriter spoke the fated words, "You may kiss the bride," and the deal was done, dear reader. I'll be back.
And Rob Doyle, who I failed to have a round of applause for his amazing threshold that I don't So I'm just going to close. I'd like to thank Mike Gatsby for buying a book from me just then. I haven't seen Mike since I was 10 years old, drinking coffee, apparently. So, yeah, old habits. But yeah, what pleasure. You know, when someone just kind of ends up living by the lake and sort of turns up at a gig. Beautiful. Like someone who was just good in my past. And we built tents.
And it was great, you know, good, only happy memories. So, yeah. Right, so this is called Ghosts of St. Leonard's. And it's all about Leonard, St. Leonard. But it's the first single that I've done as Vagrant Lovers with Danielle, and that'll be out on Bandcamp on the 31st of October. And if you buy a book this evening, I will give you a CD too, which also features Temple with the words of Malik Amir Crumpler from Deaf Press, who's an amazing writer and rapper who's based in Paris, and he's brilliant. Right. I wrote this after I'd done a tour of the church in Shoreditch with the old priest, the father, who's Paul Turk, and he knew everything about the church. He set up a lot of rehabilitation places around there. He did a lot for the strippers. He did a lot for Old Shoreditch, and he was a proper father in an area that needed it. And he knew everything about the area too. And I walked over bones in the crypt that kind of date back to all the plagues and through Shakespearean years when Shakespeare had a theatre there in the very backyard. So this was kind of inspired by this tomb that's in the centre of Shoreditch. I don't know when I started seeing ghosts, but the new ones all have cancer. Skin, putrid shoe carcass in the desert faces, I see them black, bruised, glinting, gasping for fags. In shopping lines they lock my psyche, deep-lined, eaten from the inside, knowing the secret to life is death. And flash red gone, where the fuck did they go in cars? Our side up, a side look in, passengers all morgue, mouthing incantations of mutilation, fast, absconding, edited out of time. Fucking meetings full of naive, desperate, used up hope and blame on everyone but themselves. And I don't want to bring it up in here at this church dedicated to the mentally ill, that cancer causes cancer, and all of us are living on borrowed time in the 17th century yard of Shakespeare amid the graves of the Burbages. Our pyramid temple wrapped around the tomb of a Leopold Habsburg. He's our Keith Richards meets Little Richard, prancing through Europe with his opium pipe. He was born in 1612, 999 miles from here. Saint Leonard. There are only 8 of us in the 10 a.m. It's why I come, because there are fewer people looking for answers. There's less ego-soaked lives. But there's a new girl. She's a victim to drugs, to life. She walks in, her heels are unfashionably tall, and her days are most definitely numbered. And she rolls back on the metal chairs of the institutional seating, retreating from posh Charlotte, who says, I'm not going down to see that festering cunt today. So we look down the stairs that lead to the crypt, and every time we become the death cop dissenters calling Satan for our necromancer downstairs, the reeking spirit infects us. So hippie Frank, he keeps his mouth zipped, but he can't quite help himself from peeing out words like he's wetting himself. We are fractals of ourselves, man. And the saint raped me in my bed again last night. And Leonard gets me in my bed too. I'd do anything for my prince of death, my deserter of the house of Habsburg, because he's so hot for a goth without a band. And the night terrors are easier to ride than his lucid dreams, and he pulls me into the darkness of night, and the chemo sun won't save us. Don't cunt, stealing our energy, sneers Dodgy Dave. He manages to get his end away with all of us every fucking night. And Dave dips a fifth chocolate hobnob into 5 sugared Nescafe. We're obsessed. Why can't any of you think of me when you're wanking yourselves off? And we've done our deals, I mumble, and we call the meeting to an end, and 3 smokers retreat to the honey-toned limestone steps outside, and the rest of us traipse down the crumbling damp flight to the crypt over the plague bones in the air, cooked, splitting coffins, metal and wood splinter with phantasmagorical crunch, and the bone-conjuring Jakey's hide in the warmth of the basement, sleeping on bomb shelter pews, catatonic dream shakers covered in the dust of crushed bodies as the sacrifices howl. And their fears, sonar around us morbid, I spark up a fag. A new girl. She slams up all black paint and black leather behind me, and light on her cheeks, translucent as the moon, marble, grave slabs behind her, and I see cocaine cracked around her nose, leather jacket, soul heavy from the bullets, heading straight towards her. And she's a fashion ghost anyway. So, in this subterranean vault, this slaughterhouse cellar, decent girls are not encouraged to walk past at night. Footsteps disappear in the vibrations of the bells above. And swallowed in the shelter of our Lord, we kill for him, we consume corpses, we take out all the stupid little marketeering PR bullshitters, we get drunk on their high life blood, as if their stupidity could sanitize us from the growing divide of the planet, smashing their faces of bullshitting, finally not lying. New girl, she's so about to get it. It's gone on for so long, all the backdoor bodies, the plague pit, chopping of meat, of experimental flesh, the backdoor bodies, the plague pit, chop, joining up in a maze of bodies serving St. Leonard. So we say our little prayer, and we feel the haunting. We will grow rich beneath the bells of Shoreditch. From the dwellings of the dead, we offer you the haunts of the living ghosts. Fashion ghosts fly. And the PR we sacrificed last week, she was a screecher. She'd had a long millennia, 20 years in, and all the up-all-nighters. None of us can catch up with their young years. So we suck their neck vitality on this confluence of fermented grape juice, of unleavened black bread and Roman pentangle sewers. And we lay out all the engendered. The strippers, the whores, the heroines, the nurses, the fishwives, the beer slags, the gin drunks, the artists, the PRs, the marketing cunts and the dicks of social. They all fall into our meetings, dragged in by legacy, by stories of old Shoreditch and rumours of our spirit-licking ghost, his tomb adorned with talismans in the shape of sigils draining the streets for our slaughters. We are bone masters to the church, and the church is me, our Romeo, who flattened Protestantism as we energize Habsburg in the dark, arc heart of Shoreditch. We will all kill. We will all kill. So yeah, thank you to Kieran. That was gothic. I wanted to do something gothic, you know. So yeah. So yeah, thank you a million to Rob Doyle. What a new friend. What a great guy. Writer and Kieran, Leonard. So looking forward to hearing his work. Move on and groove on, and you know we're all gonna groove on together. We're gonna go for a drink down in Eshelrak. And Danielle de Picciotto, thank you for everything. Thank you to Gilda for filming, and thank you everybody for coming and spending your evening.
Cheers, Kirsty. That last thing you read. I haven't because I've just.
Yeah, no.